Hi, I wanted to make this video because I've been thinking, and this time I've been thinking about gender. So the reason I've been thinking about gender is because I want to know what's going on. I thought I knew what it meant, but in recent years I've started to feel a bit less sure. So maybe it actually is a subject that I don't know enough about. I know it's become a bit of a political subject, but I want to be clear that this is not a political video and I have no agenda other than finding out a bit more about this subject and why it doesn't seem to be as straightforward as I was led to believe up until this point in my life. So I think it might be a bit of an uncomfortable subject because it's complicated and it's personal. But it's a human complexity that I don't know enough about, so I'm interested. So if you're also interested, this is going to be a non-political, curious look at what's been happening to the subject of gender. And I'm going to dig in a bit deeper to see what I can find out. So, can I find a definition of what exactly gender means without getting confused right from the start? I was raised with the idea that biological sex and gender were the same thing. Both were assigned at birth based on the visible look of the body when the baby was born. You didn't have to ask about them separately because they were the same thing. And I think to a large extent that is still what happens now when a baby's born. However, gender has now come to mean something different from biological sex and is being used to describe how a person feels rather than how they look. So does that mean unless we can start asking newborn babies how they feel, we should stop assigning gender at birth? Should we be separating the two things and only assigning biological sex at birth based on how the body looks and leaving gender blank until later in life? It seems like the answer to that is yes, but that would be such a huge, mind-blowing change for most people. And I'm starting to think that might be why it's a subject that's easier to stay away from. But let's not get scared. We're only looking, we're not changing anything. And let's say we don't change anything from how it's done now when a baby's born, because it does seem that the majority of people, when they become old enough to be aware, do feel that their gender, which we're taking to mean how they feel, is a match for their biological sex. So if you did want to take a guess on someone's gender at birth, even using the new definition of it being how the person feels, the smart guess would still be on matching it to the biological sex. So do we just leave it alone? That answer sounds simple, but if we want to live in an inclusive society, how can we just leave it alone when we're hearing about the distress being caused to people who tell us that their gender doesn't match their biological sex? Do we just deny what they're telling us and hope that they'll stop saying it eventually? I don't like the idea of people being in distress, so I don't like that option, and that leads me here trying to learn and understand what's really happening. So if you want to go and look up gender for yourself, you'll see that it's considered to be a social construct, meaning that depending on where you live in the world, there may be certain expectations on how you dress, how you act, depending on your biological sex. And if the way that you're supposed to act doesn't match the way that you feel, that's an indication that your gender may not be the same as your biological sex. And you'll probably feel uncomfortable trying to behave in the way that society expects you to in the place where you live. So a description that I came across recently that I found helpful in trying to understand this new information is that biological sex can be viewed as the sex of your body and gender can be viewed as the sex of your brain. And there's nothing to guarantee that both of those things are going to match. I also came across the idea that both of those things exist on a spectrum. So some people might look very male or very female in a biological sense, and some people might feel very male or very female in terms of their personality or emotions. So you could end up with a strong match or a strong mismatch, or most likely something in between. So when I think of it like that, it's easier to understand why it's such a complicated subject. And if I think about relating that to myself, which isn't something that I've ever thought about or been encouraged to think about in my whole life, what do I come up with? So I think I look female and I think I feel female, but not to any sort of extreme. Although I wouldn't like it if people thought I was male. So that's an interesting thing to consider, because I can see that it might cause me distress if I looked more male and people might think I was male when I feel female. So maybe in the future we'll all be more encouraged to think about how we really feel rather than how we're expected to feel. I like learning more about myself, so I've been interested to think about whether I can relate any of this to myself. So now I feel a bit clearer about why gender has become more confusing compared with what I was taught when I was growing up. I'd also like to feel clearer about what some of the other words I've been hearing in connection with gender actually mean. So if, like me, your biological sex matches the way that you feel, you'd be considered cisgender. So a male body matching a male mind is cis male, and a female body matching a female mind is cis female. That's the easy one. Things get a bit more complicated when we talk about people who find that they don't have a match between their biological sex and their gender or the way they feel. So for people who aren't sure how they feel, or who sometimes feel male and sometimes feel female, they might identify as non-binary. So with non-binary meaning that they don't feel male or female, or how they feel might change day to day. So they often prefer to use the pronoun they because it doesn't feel right to them to be called he or she when it doesn't match how they feel. So people who do feel male or female, but where this feeling is a mismatch with their biological sex, can start to experience body dysmorphia. So I think body dysmorphia is considered to be a mental health condition, but from my non-expert point of view, it seems more like it would be an expected reaction to having a brain or feelings that don't match your biological sex. Anyway, people who experience body dysmorphia often want to change their appearance so that it feels a closer match to how they feel. And those people would be defined as transgender, meaning that they want to change their body or the way they look to match the way that they feel. So I think this one gets extra complicated because of the fact that nobody can truly change their biology, even though they might want to. So I don't think anyone is denying that, and that transgender people just want to live in a way that feels right for them. But I also see how medically and maybe socially that could get a bit complicated. But, just because it's complicated, we shouldn't pretend that it isn't happening. So I'm not saying that I have the answers, just that if I've understood correctly, I can see that it's complicated. I know that there's surely more to gender than I've covered today, but I'm just a beginner, so I want to keep it as simple as I can for now. So what learning am I taking away with me after this? Well, I've learned that just because my brain seems to match my body, that doesn't mean it's the same for everyone. I've learned that what I was taught growing up wasn't necessarily the reality, but that it probably was the best we understood at the time. And sometimes things only become clearer over time. I've learnt that life and humans are complicated, but also fascinating. I've learnt that I don't want people to suffer or feel distress if I can help it. But I can see that this is a subject that does bring some suffering and distress to people. I've learnt that gender stereotypes might be damaging for children because some of them are probably going to find out that their feelings don't match their biological sex once they're old enough to realise. And the more they've been stereotyped up until that point, the harder it might be for them. I've learnt that we shouldn't ever stop listening and learning about other people if we want to live in a happy, inclusive society. And that applies in all directions. And, I'm admitting that I was naive about this subject, and I hope I haven't offended anyone. I also hope that by sharing my naivety, but also my willingness to listen and learn, it might help us all to understand each other a bit better. So, getting back to the original question, what's going on with gender and why don't I know what it means anymore? So, I think nothing's really going on with gender. We're just finding better ways to explain the different experiences that we have as complicated humans. I needed to learn a few new words to open my mind to some new information, but I think I've learned some useful things and I feel better for it. So I hope you've taken something useful from this video, but I think that's all for this time. Thanks for watching and hope to see you next time. Bye.